Call the banners, summon the Rohirrim. I'm calling in my favour. I owe you a debt. These are all examples of obligation that forces action by reminding a character that they don't live in a vacuum, that they are surrounded by people to whom they might owe action. But how can you use obligation in a fantasy world? How can you motivate characters with it? And how do you set it up so that it feels organic, so that it feels as though that obligation is embedded into your world? That is what I want to talk about today. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you have not yet done so, please do hit the subscribe button down below. And if you would like to be part of the world building community of my channel, I do have a Discord server. And if you like what I do here and want to support it, check out my Ko-fi page, or you can buy my book available on Amazon. Okay, let's get cracking with today's video about obligation. In a fantasy world, the first and most obvious obligation is that of a liege and a liege man. So it is somebody to whom a character has sworn an oath of loyalty, and somebody who in return owes them their loyalty as a lord. Noble obligation doesn't just run up, it also runs down. A king wasn't quite as authoritarian as you might think, and a king who never showed loyalty to those under him would very easily find himself the casus belli of a rebellion and could quite easily lose his head. This illustration of loyalty running down as well as up is beautifully done in the Dresden Files with the Fey Court, specifically the Winter Court. This is a small spoiler for Dresden Files. I think this happens in about book 6 or so. So in the Dresden Files, the Lyanna Shee is Harry Dresden's fairy godmother. And she normally does him some favors, and he owes her some favors due to various actions that he's taken. Somewhere in the middle books, the Lyanna Shee becomes indisposed, and she can no longer answer Dresden's requests as his fairy godmother. The Lyanna Shee's direct liege, the person to whom she has sworn her loyalty, is Queen Mab, the Queen of Air and Darkness. So with the Lyanna Shee indisposed, the duty of being Harry Dresden's godmother devolves upward to Queen Mab, which is technically an upgrade, although I'm pretty sure that Harry doesn't see it that way. I'm not sure I would either, but it is a very good illustration of how liege also goes up and not just down. In the more traditional sense of noble obligations, during the 100 Years' War, French villages had to supply X number of men-at-arms depending on their wealth as a village. So a poor village had to supply 1 man-at-arms to the king's army, a richer village had to supply 2, towns had to supply a number per inhabitant, and so on. It was the responsibility of these villages to outfit and ensure that those men-at-arms were trained. It's kind of a manpower tax, if you will. The key thing here is they didn't have to be an inhabitant of the village. If the village was rich enough, they could hire a mercenary. But if they weren't, they would have to outfit somebody as best they could, and that person would have to go and represent the village in the king's army. There's also the obligations of free men to the law. It's not just the case of war. One of the earliest forms of law in England was the shire courts, where every man over the age of 12 had to participate when hue and cry was raised to capture criminals who belonged to his shire. The shire was responsible for bringing such criminals before the sheriff, who would in turn punish those criminals. If a shire did not capture their criminals, they could be held responsible as a collective for the breaking of the law. So there was an obligation imposed on being a free man in terms of upholding the law, not just in terms of military service. And then, of course, you have obligations of service, people who are required to serve others. A great example of this is noble pages. Pages were fostered out to different families at the age of 7, and they spent the next 5, maybe 7 odd years training, but also serving. They served their noble master at meals, they ensured that they had clean clothes, they in general looked after their noble master, and in return they were taught all manner of skills relating to being a noble and learning how to be a knight. Nobles also had gentlemen and ladies in waiting who served that noble, and in return they got a house over their head, they had clothes, they had meals, etc. They also had access to the noble, and the same applied to pages. These people formed bonds of friendship between them, and they spoke to each other continuously. And because of that, this formed obligations that were as important as familial obligations. In some ways, the noble that a page served their fosterage with would be more of a parent to them than their own father and mother. They would relate to that noble much more because they would have spent much more time with that noble. This is most clearly illustrated in Game of Thrones, where both Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon served as pages in Jon Arryn's household, which is why both of them were like brothers to each other because they had served together as pages, and why they looked up to Jon Arryn as their father figure rather than looking to their own father figures. One of the most interesting takes that I've seen on this is in Catherine Kerr's books, where Rodri, one of her nobles, does not foster out his son to anybody else. Instead, he has his son serve him directly as a page boy, and he trains his son himself in the art of being a noble. And the boy actually reflects at one point that he would never do that to his own sons, because in a world where your title is completely dependent on your parent dying, you don't actually want to love your parent that much. You actually want to be able to appreciate them dying someday so that you can get the title. This kind of obligation, the obligation to your liege, the obligation that family brings, the obligation of a noble court and of service, is a standard across many, many fantasy books, including my own. If you enjoyed looking at obligation as a familial thing, hit the like button, and in the comment section let me know what other aspects of liegemanship and liege and that kind of noble relationship you would like me to explore. And let's move on to the obligation of promises. Quite often in fantasy worlds, you will have people making oaths to do things. Now, sometimes those oaths are just promises made upon their honor, and sometimes those oaths are enforced by magic as per contract magic. Sometimes those oaths are made on behalf of a family, and a family becomes responsible for protecting a sword, protecting a stone, feeding a puppy, or, as I do in my world, protecting the Bloodgate that keeps back the evil Ossiped Marlow who would eat the world. That is a very interesting obligation-based commitment. When somebody finds out about it, their reaction can go one of a number of ways. They can be resentful because their whole life has been decided for them by this promise that might have been made generations before their time. Or they could be proud that this is going to be their life, that their life is going to mean something. Either way, once they take over this commitment to doing the familial task, there's a couple of important questions. What happens if their commitment fails? What happens if the Bloodgate opens and Ossiped Marlow comes out and starts eating the world? This, of course, can be a driving motivation to do all manner of things. What happens if complications arise? What if the sword that you are committed to defending gets stolen, or the blue stone that you are committed to protecting gets stolen? You can do multi-layered sagas based around a family's commitment to upholding a promise, and that is also a type of obligation driving a character. Then, of course, there's the obligation of doing your job. In this case, I'm not talking about you have to pay your bills. Of course, everybody has to pay their bills. I'm more talking in terms of guilds, apprenticeships, and the obligation that an apprentice has to their master. Now, I did speak about page boys, but there is also trade apprenticeship. Anne McCaffrey uses trade apprenticeships particularly well, in that any child who wants to learn a craft, such as being a drummer, even being a farmer, being a smith, whatever, they go to the guild. And in the guild, they have apprenticeship duties to fulfill. They have to make instruments, they have to learn, they have to serve a table, all kinds of apprenticeship duties. And then eventually they become journeymen, but they still have the obligation to the guild that they set as apprenticeships. And even when they become masters, they are still a member of the guild. The guild trained them. The guild is their professional association of people, and they have a responsibility to all of the other masters in their guild. Guilds can form a fantastic obligation in terms of character motivations, because the guild can demand that you need to do certain things which you might or might not agree with. But if you go against the guild, that has professional consequences that will deeply impact your life. I did, of course, make a number of videos about guilds, so if you haven't yet, check out my guild videos. And if you enjoyed thinking about the obligation that guilds bring, hit the like button. And let's talk about the obligation around debt. Now, when I'm speaking about the obligation that debt brings, I don't mean monetary debt. I don't mean that you have to pay back your debt that you owe somebody, though, of course, that is a form of obligation. What I'm talking about is more the obligation that favors bring. Especially in certain magic systems, favors is a tradable resource. The Liana Shi was Dresden's fairy godmother, but he also owed her favors. Those favors were traded to Mab. So Dresden, without knowing what was going on, found himself owing Mab favors, which was a lot more serious than owing a favor to the Liana Shi. Another great use of this is in Once Upon a Time with Rumpelstiltskin. Now, Rumpel builds up a whole network of favors. He is willing to make a deal with everyone, and he can then use those favors as leverage to get done almost anything that he wants to get done. But he's also willing to let other people take on the debt and obligation that are incurred by favors. As an example of this, in the curse world of Once Upon a Time, Cinderella makes a deal with Rumpelstiltskin that she would give up her baby in return for a sum of money. When push comes to shove, she doesn't want to do that. But Rumpel doesn't let people out of deals. That's not how it works. The main character, Emma, then goes into a deal with Rumpel where she owes him a favor in return for him letting Ella out of her deal. In effect, Emma takes on the obligation of paying Cinderella's part of the deal to Rumpel. And so trading favors can become a really fundamental way in which you motivate characters to do things that they really don't want to do. Because once you owe somebody a favor, you can end up owing anybody a favor. And if you have a magic system that works around favors and contract magic, you can end up in a situation where you have to figure out a way around this favor that might go against your moral code to repay. But even if it's not a magical favor, even if it's just a social convention favor, if you break enough of your promises, you become an immoral person anyway. So if you owe somebody a favor, it can be a powerful motivating factor even without magic. And of course, you can also have families inheriting debt. Children could inherit the debt of their parents, or children could get into trouble, causing the parents to need to go into debt, either favor or monetary, to bail their kids out. And either way, you make a fascinating story around the obligations of both family and the obligation of debt. And that is my thought on obligations and how to use it in fantasy plots. If you enjoyed this, you'll probably enjoy my video on contract magic, so be sure to check that out and hit the thumbs up button, and I will see you soon for another one.